All right, so we're going to go ahead and start with the heart in chapter 12. And so, as a reminder, our cardiovascular system consists of the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood itself, which we talked about last chapter. Our heart is a big muscle made up of cardiac muscle that's essential for life. Obviously, it pumps the blood through our body, and that contains our kind of everything that we need for our cells to survive: oxygen, glucose, all the other nutrients that we travel with. So, a healthy adult heart at rest is going to pump about 5 liters of blood per minute. So, 5 liters of blood per minute. So, we would consider that their cardiac output. So, if you take your heart rate, which is how many beats per minute your heart beats, and you multiply it by your stroke volume, which is how much blood your heart ejects each heartbeat, then you can get your cardiac output. So here's just kind of an overview of our cardiovascular system. You'll see our vessels that are closer to the heart are much larger, and as we spread out throughout the body, they're going to get much smaller, and we'll talk about that in chapter 13. So our cardiovascular system and our heart is really two pumps in one. So we talk about our pulmonary circulation versus our systemic circulation. So our pulmonary circulation is referring to our heart pumping blood to the lungs and that blood returning to the heart. So that's going to be pumped from the right side of the heart. So our right ventricle is going to pump blood into the lungs, and then the lungs are going to send that blood back to the left side of the heart and empty it into our left atrium. So that's our pulmonary circulation. Our left ventricle is going to pump blood out to the body. That's going to go all the way to all our different tissues. Our tissues are going to take those nutrients, drop off their wastes and more fluid, and that's going to head back to the right side or right atrium via our veins, and that's our systemic circulation. So this shows an overview of that. So the pulmonary circulation is a part of our systemic circulation. So our pulmonary circulation, we're referring to the deoxygenated blood in the right side, getting to the lungs, getting oxygenated, and then going back to the left side. Systemic, we're talking about blood being pumped out by that left ventricle. It's going to travel all the way to our tissues and end up back at the heart. So some functions for our heart, of course, we're going to generate blood pressure. So every time our heart beats, that's going to put pressure on our vessels. It's going to route our blood, or actually tell our blood where to go in a sense. It ensures one-way blood flow with our heart valves. We'll talk about those a little bit. And it helps regulate our blood supply. So different nervous system input can regulate how hard our heart is beating, and that's going to influence how much blood our heart is pumping at one time. So your heart is a big muscle. It only weighs about 1 pound and is the size of a fist. And we find it in between the lungs and thoracic cavity. So you can see here that it sits a little more on that left side. Our left lung has a bit of a gap there called the cardiac notch, where our heart kind of fits into the indent. And in our heart, this bottom left is our apex. And then this upper portion we call the base. So our pericardium is a double-layered sac. It's a serous membrane, so it has those two layers. Remember, the parietal layer is always going to be around the cavity itself, in this case, the pericardial cavity, and our visceral layer is going to be directly against the heart. So the visceral pericardium is directly on the heart surface. Our parietal pericardium is surrounding our pericardial cavity. In between our parietal and visceral layer, we're going to find fluid called pericardial fluid, and that is going to prevent friction and rubbing between our two different layers. So here's the surface anatomy of the heart. Not too much to point out here. This is your left side, right side. You'll see our inferior vena cava and superior vena cava are kind of anterior to our aorta. You can see the pulmonary trunk that contains our pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins behind it, but not much to point out here. On the back side of the heart, one thing I want to point out is we have our great cardiac vein and the coronary sinus. And so these are going to be two of the main veins that drain our heart itself. You can see some of these arteries here that are traveling down the heart. Remember, the heart's a muscle, so it needs to be supplied with blood itself to keep pumping. So our heart has vessels that deliver blood via arteries and drain blood back into the right atrium, like I said, via the coronary sinus and great cardiac vein. So our heart has 4 different chambers. If you've already worked through your lab this week, then some of this stuff should be a review. So our upper chambers are the atria. We have our left atrium and right atrium, and then our lower chambers are the ventricles, our left ventricle and right ventricle. So atria are the superior. They're going to receive blood from our veins. So veins are always going to bring blood back to the heart. They're small and thin-walled. They don't need to contract much. They have gravity on their side. They're going to drain into our ventricles. So the blood is going to naturally go. The little bit of contraction is there just to get the last drops out. They're separated by the interatrial septum. And so it sounds exactly what it does, interatrial, between the atria. And so that's just going to be a wall that separates our right and left, which will help us separate the deoxygenated from oxygenated blood that we'll talk about. Our ventricles are going to be the lower chambers. They're much thicker walled, and it's really just because they have a much thicker muscle layer, because these are our chambers that are in charge of actually pumping blood out of our heart into the arteries. So our right side is going to pump blood to the lungs, our left side pumping blood to the bodies. They also have a septum. This time it's the interventricular septum because it's going to separate right and left ventricles. So we said one of our heart's functions was to make sure that blood is flowing in the correct direction, and the way it does that is via these heart valves. So the first type of valve we'll talk about is our atrioventricular valve. So those are referred to as the AV valves. We have our tricuspid valve, which is the AV valve on our right side between the right atrium and right ventricle, and our bicuspid or mitral valve, which is the AV valve between our left atrium and left ventricle. So the atrioventricular valves are going to be the separation or the passing point for blood from atria to ventricles. This term cusps down here, I'll point it out when we see an interior view of the heart, but it's just the way that our valves are attached to our heart wall and how they function. But our tricuspid valve has kind of 3 anchor points, while our bicuspid valve only has 2 anchor points, which is how they get their name. And you'll notice our bicuspid valve is also and often referred to as the mitral valve. The other type of valves we have are known as semilunar valves because they have kind of a half moon shape to them. And so these are going to be between our ventricles and arteries. So we have a pulmonary valve that's going to separate our right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk. And then our aortic valve is going to separate the left ventricle from the aorta. So down here, these little strings and attachments, they're called chordae tendineae. These are our cusps. So this is the bicuspid valve open. You see they have 2 anchors here, bicuspid. And so this is the valve closed. So when these are relaxed, they can open. When these get taut, it's closing up. All right, here's our internal view of the heart. So you can see our upper chambers here, our right and left atrium, our right and left ventricle. You can see the interventricular septum and how much thicker this muscle wall is. You'll notice that the left ventricle has the thickest muscle wall by far because it is responsible for pumping all the way out into the body against our body's blood pressure. You see our tricuspid valve and bicuspid valve separating our atrium and ventricle, our pulmonary valve and aortic valve So that's going to separate the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle and the aorta from the left ventricle. So let's go through here. And so what I want you to be able to understand or feel confident in is being able to put all of these in order in terms of how our blood flows through the heart. One of the other things you'll notice is we have blue and red. So blue is going to be deoxygenated. Red is going to be oxygenated blood. So you should know which areas have deoxygenated versus oxygenated blood. This little diagram down here, more or less, is this same order. It just has a little extra column that shows how blood is going to flow into the heart as well. So just to walk through this, we'll do this with the arrows, and then I'll pop back up to our slide above where we have a little bigger view of the heart. So what's not included up here is that our blood that's coming back from our upper body and lower body is going to come to our right atrium via the superior and inferior vena cava. So those are our two major veins that are going to bring blood back to the heart from the body. So that blood is going to empty into the right atrium. So we're starting on the right side of our heart. That blood is going to be deoxygenated because it just came back from our body's tissues. They used up all the oxygen and nutrients. That's why they're sending it back to kind of reload. So our right atrium is going to empty into our right ventricle. But to do that, it has to pass through our tricuspid valve. So the tricuspid valve will open and our atria will drain blood into the ventricle. Now we're in the right ventricle, and our right ventricle's job is to pump blood to the lungs. So when our right ventricle contracts, the pulmonary valve will open, the blood will travel up the pulmonary trunk and into the pulmonary arteries. So these are pulmonary arteries. So remember, the rule is that arteries carry away. So arteries are always going to carry blood away from the heart. So we're traveling through the pulmonary arteries because we are going away from the heart to the lungs. And you notice we're still blue. All of this is deoxygenated blood because we haven't gotten to the lungs yet. So now we're here at number 7. We're in the lungs. This is where our blood is going to pick up its oxygen and drop off its carbon dioxide. So step 1 through 6 is all deoxygenated blood. Step 7, our blood gains its oxygen from the lungs. And so now our lungs are going to send that oxygenated blood back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. Veins are always going to bring blood back to the heart. So now we have oxygenated blood flowing through the pulmonary veins, and that's how we get to our left side. So those pulmonary veins are going to empty into our left atrium. Our left atrium is going to be a storage center of blood before it goes into the left ventricle. And so we pass through our bicuspid or mitral valve to fill the left ventricle. Our left ventricle has that thick muscle so that when it squeezes, it can pump through the aortic valve into the aorta, and our aorta is going to bring blood to the rest of the body. So all of our arteries that spread out throughout the body all branch off of our aorta. So steps 8 through 14 are going to have oxygenated blood. So I know there's a lot of steps there, but you should be able to get that pathway down. So listen to that again if you need to. Now I'm going to pop up here. This is a good place to practice because now you can't see the numbers, so you got to really know it. I think writing this out, especially using blue and red pen or blue and red colored pencils, can be very helpful for this one. And the other thing I always try to remind people is when you're looking at your screen, this is your left side of your screen, but remember it's the right side of the heart. This is the right side of your screen, but it's the left side of the heart. So don't mess that part up either. So blood's going to come back to the right atrium via the inferior and superior vena cava. That blood from our atrium is going to pass through the tricuspid valve and fill our right ventricle. Our right ventricle's job is to get blood to the lungs. It pumps through the pulmonary valve, up the pulmonary trunk, and into the pulmonary arteries. So the pulmonary arteries are going to carry that deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Our lungs are going to oxygenate the blood, and then our blood needs to get back to the heart. It's going to do that via the pulmonary veins. Those pulmonary veins are going to empty into our left atrium, and now we have oxygenated blood in that left side of the heart. That blood from our left atrium will pass through the open bicuspid or mitral valve to get to our left ventricle. Our left ventricle contracts to pump blood through our aortic valve into the aorta, and that's how it gets to the rest of our body. When our body's tissues are done with it, they're going to send it back through the veins, and those all lead back to our inferior and superior vena cava. So it's one big loop. Okay, our heart wall itself is three different layers. We have the epicardium, which is the outer portion of the heart. And so our epicardium is continuous with our visceral pericardium. So they're really the same thing. The thickest layers are myocardium. Anytime you see myo, you know it's referring to a muscle layer. So this is our thick cardiac muscle. The endocardium is a nice, smooth, thin inner surface. So we've talked about cardiac muscle in a few chapters, but just to remind you, our cardiac muscle has one central nucleus. Its cells have branches that reach out to other cardiac muscle cells. We have a lot of mitochondria in our cardiac muscle. Remember, mitochondria are our powerhouses. They're our power plants for the cell. They produce energy in the form of ATP. Our heart's a big muscle. It's beating 24/7, so it's going to need a lot of ATP to allow it to do that. Our heart muscle is striated. That means it has a striped appearance because it has both myofilaments, actin and myosin. Just like a skeletal muscle, it's going to utilize calcium and ATP to form that cross bridge to contract. And then we have another special structure called intercalated discs in between each of our cardiac muscle, and they help us to transmit signals quickly. There's a practice question in your virtual lab related to intercalated discs. So our heart is a coordinated contraction and relaxation to move blood from the atria to the ventricles. So at some points, our entire heart is at rest. All four chambers relax together. So we call that passive filling. So the heart's just relaxed, blood is just filling in. Cardiac muscles in our atrial wall are going to be stimulated by a cardiac nerve or node known as the SA node. So our SA node is our primary pacemaker. It's going to be the nerve or nerve kind of cluster that starts our heartbeat. So it's located up towards the right atrium. And so when it creates an action potential, that's going to start spreading across both atrial walls. So our muscle cells in the atria are going to begin to contract, and that helps push that last bit of blood into the ventricles. That signal is going to travel down through the AV node, then into the bundle of His, and then into our Purkinje fibers, and that spreads it all the way across the ventricular walls. So now our ventricles are going to contract, and that's what pushes blood into our great arteries, which are the pulmonary arteries and our aorta. So the atria and ventricles kind of contract together. It's not like the right side goes first and then the left side goes first. It's more kind of the top half, our atria contract, and then our ventricles contract, and then everything relaxes together. So this is our SA node up here. It stimulates the atria first. That signal gets to the AV node. and then it travels down our right and left bundles to the Purkinje fibers. It hits this apex first before traveling up to the bases, and that causes our ventricles to contract. Remember, our right side is going to push blood through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries, and our left ventricle is going to push through the aortic valve to send blood to the aorta in the body. So we call this our cardiac conduction system. All four parts of our conduction system are able to produce spontaneous or kind of rhythmic action potentials without any input from the brain or brainstem itself. So our SA node beats at about 60 to 100 beats per minute. It's just going to fire off on that automatic pattern. Our AV node, which is our second stop in the line, is going to beat at about 40 beats per minute. And then our bundle branches and Purkinje fibers are really only going to beat at about 20 beats per minute. So really, without the SA node, your heart conduction system doesn't quite beat fast enough to sustain us. So just a kind of quick run through this again. We have our SA node, that's our primary pacemaker, going to beat 60 to 100 beats per minute. That sends its signal to the AV node. We have right and left bundle branches that carry it down, and then to the Purkinje fibers. And sometimes you'll see these bundle branches referred to as the bundle of His. And so my way to remember this pathway in school was always save his perk. So save, SAAV, his, the bundles of His, and perk for Purkinje fibers. So hopefully that helps somebody. The last thing we're going to touch on is a couple different heart diseases. So coronary artery disease is going to be a disease that decreases the blood supply to our heart because our arteries are narrowed. Sometimes this can be due to diabetes from different kind of the influence of too much sugar on our arteries. Sometimes this can be plaques building up, like atherosclerosis. And so this is going to be a narrowing of the arteries, so not as much blood can get through, meaning our heart is not going to get as much supply. So this isn't meaning that our right atrium is getting less return. This is our actual heart muscle that is not getting enough blood supply. An MI is when coronary arteries or the arteries that supply the heart actually close. And so an area that doesn't have a coronary artery supplying it is going to end up dying and getting a scar. And so that's why people get that pain and have issues, is because they're actually having death of their cardiac muscle. So a couple procedures they can do to try to prevent this is an angioplasty. So this is when they're going to open up a blocked vessel. They may be able to clean it out and then sew it back up if it's relatively minor blockage. A stent you can kind of think of as a mesh tunnel. And so they put this through with a catheter, meaning they kind of go through your wrist or your groin and they travel all the way up to your heart. And they put in this little tunnel in a vessel that gives it some support to make sure that it stays open. This is how they can prevent a collapse. And then if a coronary artery is so blocked that they can't put a stent in or fix it, then they have to bypass it. And so they'll either take an artery or a vein from somewhere else in the body, and they will kind of cut out a little piece. They'll move it up to your heart, and they'll reroute the blood around that blocked artery into the area that was not getting supply anymore. So think of it kind of like an overpass to avoid traffic. And then that is our heart chapter. So keep an eye out for chapter 13. That's our circulatory system. We'll start talking about where that blood goes after it gets out of our heart.